On a cold, frosty night, Mark and Susan were driving home after enjoying a delightful dinner with some friends. As they traveled down a particularly desolate stretch of the highway, they both noticed something unusual by the roadside. There, barely visible under the faint glow of the streetlights, was a shivering dog. Feeling a pang of sympathy for the poor creature, they decided to stop and see if they could help. Mark pulled the car over to the shoulder, and they both got out. Mark, seeing the dog's shivering state, quickly returned to the car to grab a blanket they kept in the back seat. He gently wrapped the dog in the warm fabric, trying to protect it from the biting cold, and carried it back to the car. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. As they drove home, the couple discussed how they could care for the frightened creature. Once they arrived home, they immediately set to work preparing a cozy spot for the new guest. Mark poured some fresh water into a bowl and set out some food they had in the pantry. The dog cautiously began to explore the house, moving slowly as it inspected each room. The next morning, they took the dog to the vet for a thorough checkup. The vet examined the dog carefully, looking for any signs of injury or illness. The vet informed them that the dog was generally healthy but a bit undernourished. They checked for a microchip, hoping to find the owner, but there was none. It seemed the dog was a stray. After much discussion, Mark and Susan decided to keep the dog. They decided to name him Max, feeling it was a strong and fitting name for their new family member. Max appeared to settle in well, and even began to show his playful side. They spent hours playing fetch and teaching him basic commands. However, their joy was soon overshadowed by some strange behaviors that began to emerge. Max, who had initially seemed so gentle and playful, started acting unpredictably. At times, he would freeze and stare at empty corners, his hackles raised. Other times, he would dart from room to room, as if being chased by something unseen. These odd behaviors began to unsettle Mark and Susan, leaving them wondering what could be causing such changes. Max's behavior took a more alarming turn when he began to growl aggressively at unexpected moments. The gentle dog they had brought home was now startling them with his sudden fits of aggression. Mark and Susan found themselves increasingly on edge, unsure of how to handle these sudden behavioral shifts in Max. One night, Mark and Susan were jolted awake by the sound of frantic scratching. They rushed to the living room to find Max aggressively clawing at the front door. His growls were low and menacing, and his entire body was tense. It was as if he was trying to get out, or perhaps trying to keep something from getting in. They were deeply unsettled by this behavior, and despite growing worries, Mark and Susan tried to rationalize Max's behavior. They told themselves it was just nervousness or trauma from his past. They hoped that with time and love, Max would overcome his fears and stop acting out. In desperation, Susan enrolled Max in an obedience training class to curb his aggressive tendencies. She hoped professional guidance would help Max become a more predictable and well-behaved pet. During one of the training sessions, the trainer pulled Susan aside. He shared his observations, noting that Max seemed unusually difficult to control compared to other dogs. He pointed out that Max's aggression wasn't just a simple behavioral issue, it seemed to stem from something more complex. Hearing this, Susan grew even more concerned. Despite their best efforts, Max's behaviors grew increasingly unpredictable. One moment he would be calm and affectionate, the next he would be snarling and aggressive. They began questioning whether adopting Max was the right decision. Mark decided to install a security camera in their living room to monitor Max's behavior while they were not at home. Over the next few days, Mark and Susan reviewed the footage from the security camera. To their dismay, they saw Max pacing back and forth, barking at empty spaces, and even growling at seemingly nothing. One evening, Mark and Susan returned home to find their living room in complete disarray. Couch cushions were torn, and wooden furniture had been clawed and chewed up. Determined to resolve the issue, Mark and Susan decided to give Max more attention and exercise. They took him on longer walks, played games to tire him out, and showered him with affection. Despite their best efforts, the incidents continued. Max's unsettling behavior extended to anyone who visited their home. He began growling at guests, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere during their gatherings. In a bid to find answers, Mark and Susan decided to take Max to another veterinarian for a more thorough evaluation. After a careful examination, the vet hinted at the possibility that Max might be experiencing trauma from his past. Hearing this, Mark and Susan felt a mix of sadness and frustration. Determined to uncover Max's past, Mark decided to conduct some research on his own. Susan decided to take a different approach by posting flyers and social media messages asking if anyone recognized Max. She included pictures and a detailed description, hoping that someone might come forward with information. A few days later, they received an anonymous tip that darkened their hopes. The tip suggested that the dog could have been part of a clandestine and illegal operation. Shocked by the tip, Mark and Susan began to piece together the unsettling truth about Max. Realizing they might be in over their heads, Mark and Susan contacted local authorities for assistance. They hoped the police or animal control could intervene, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. The authorities seemed disinterested or too busy to help, offering only generic advice. One morning, they discovered strange markings near their windows and doors. The markings resembled symbols or messages, something they couldn't interpret but found deeply unsettling. It was as though someone had been lurking outside, leaving cryptic signs behind. This new development only added to their fear and confusion. Susan began to fear that keeping Max might have put them in danger. Despite Susan's growing fears, Mark insisted on keeping Max until they could learn more about his origins. As the days passed, Max became increasingly aggressive and difficult to handle. Even simple tasks like feeding him or taking him for a walk turned into challenges. One afternoon, a stranger lingered outside their home, making them both uneasy. The man seemed to be observing their house, possibly even casing it. Mark approached him, but the stranger quickly walked away without saying a word. The unsettling encounter left both Mark and Susan even more paranoid. Their once cozy home had become a place of perpetual fear. They found it challenging to talk to friends or family about their troubles, fearing they wouldn't understand or believe their unbelievable situation. Max's health began to deteriorate, adding another layer of worry for Mark and Susan. One night, Mark received a mysterious phone call. The voice on the other end was unrecognizable, but the message was chillingly clear. They needed to get rid of Max. The caller warned them of grave consequences if they chose to keep him. Mark's blood ran cold as he listened, realizing this situation was far more dangerous than they had initially thought. They debated their options endlessly, but found no clear solution. They feared that giving Max away might not end their troubles, and they couldn't bear the thought of abandoning him in his condition. Desperation led Susan to consider taking Max to a shelter. It was a heart-wrenching decision, and they felt paralyzed by uncertainty. Out of the blue, they received another anonymous tip that led them to believe Max had been part of an underground dog-fighting ring. This revelation was both disturbing and enlightening. It explained his aggressive behavior and health issues. Mark and Susan were horrified at the thought of Max being subjected to such cruelty. They realized they were entangled in a situation far more sinister than they had ever imagined. The tip about the dog-fighting ring made Mark and Susan see Max in a new light. They realized his aggression might have been trained into him through abuse. Desperate for guidance, Mark and Susan contacted an animal rights organization. They explained Max's situation and the disturbing discoveries they had made. The organization agreed to help, offering advice and resources. It was a small glimmer of hope in their otherwise bleak situation. The animal rights organization advised them to stay low and limit communication regarding Max. They explained that the people involved in illegal dog-fighting rings could be extremely dangerous and unpredictable. One morning, Mark and Susan were shocked to find an anonymous note in their mailbox. The note was chilling, threatening harm if they didn't comply with unspecified demands. Fearful for their safety and desperate for answers, Mark and Susan decided they needed to confront the people behind the operation. They debated whether to go to the police or take matters into their own hands. Ultimately, they felt the authorities had been too slow and they needed immediate action. To gather more information, they decided to meet the tipster who had contacted them before. The person agreed to meet but demanded anonymity and extreme caution. Arrangements were made to meet at a secluded location under the cover of darkness. At the meeting, the tipster revealed some alarming facts. The individuals involved in the dogfighting ring were not only dangerous but well-connected. Mark and Susan realized the risk to their lives had grown exponentially. Yet the clarity of knowing what they were up against provided a grim sense of direction. As the days passed, the intensity of the threat became more tangible. Strange vehicles started appearing near their house, and unfamiliar people seemed to be watching their movements. Mark decided to bolster their home security. He installed additional security cameras around the perimeter of their house and set up a panic system that would alert authorities immediately. While dealing with external threats, Max's behavior took a turn for the worse. They considered sedating him or finding a specialist, but those options were temporary solutions to a problem that seemed to grow each day. On a freezing night, Mark and Susan's worst fears materialized. An intruder broke into their home, shattering the fragile sense of security they had left. In the chaos, Max viciously attacked the intruder, his growls and barks echoing through the cold air. By the time Mark and Susan reached Max, the intruder had been driven off, wounded. They were left shaken, realizing the very real dangers now facing them. Frightened by the break-in, Mark rushed to send the footage of the intruder and Max's attack to the authorities. They were finally being heard, and the authorities were now fully on their side. Undercover agents began to infiltrate the network, gathering substantial evidence to bring those involved to justice. Amid the police investigation, Max's original owners tried to reclaim him illegally through legal loopholes. They presented fraudulent documents and attempted to manipulate the legal system to get Max back. Mark and Susan were furious and terrified. They knew Max was safer with them. Their determination to protect him solidified. They decided to fight back with every piece of evidence and resource they had at their disposal. With the capture of his abusers, Max's behavior began to change noticeably. He seemed less aggressive and more at ease. It was as though the tension and fear that had gripped him were slowly being released. The couple was resolved to provide the care and love Max needed to recover from his traumatic past and live peacefully. Mark and Susan began working with an animal behavior specialist to help Max recover. The specialist created a detailed plan tailored to Max's needs, focusing on building trust and reducing